It can be almost impossible to predict the future. It would have been unheard of from someone from the 80s to look at a smartphone today, something with more ability, more power in it than the computers that brought us to the moon. So today we're going to try to do exactly that from the lens of the number one expert, Jean Twenge. We're going to hear her thoughts on what the future for our generation and the other living generations and what could be in store for us. So let's look into it. On this channel, we've done a bunch of videos on Jean Twenge, who, like I said a million times, is probably the number one generational expert. And she knows a great deal about Generation Z. A lot of the work that we've done here has been focused on her book Generations, and it wraps up with a look into the future, into the trends that are projected outward across time. But something important that we have to keep in mind is just because something is trending a certain way does not mean it's going to go that way infinitum, that forever we're going to have a faster car or a better phone. Instead, there's going to be huge pivots to brand new things that we couldn't have seen coming. I think a great example of this might have been AI, where all of a sudden it seemed out of nowhere something with great capabilities just emerged, and now people are using it every day. Whereas if you talked to someone 10 years ago, they would have never even thought that that would have happened so quickly. And she uses in her book the idea of the Jetsons, the TV show Jetsons. Now, if you're Generation Z like I am, you might not have seen that show, but it was this cute little cartoon that talked about the future, and it was, a little bit of a sitcom, kind of like the Flintstones, but futuristic. And one big thing she says is that they got a lot of things right. You go back and watch it, they got a lot of very interesting things right. I think one of them was video conferencing. I think all the way back then, they had the idea of video conferencing. But what is a big difference that they didn't see coming? Well, they didn't see that Mrs. Jetson wouldn't have worked just in the home. She wouldn't have been just a homemaker. Instead, today, if Mrs. Jetson existed, she would probably have her own job and her own career. She might not be a homemaker. And that was something that they didn't see coming. So they were able to see some trends, some technological trends, but other ones totally came out of the blue. And that's something we have to keep in mind. So as I go about this, I would love to hear your thoughts about what might be the big innovations, the big changes that are in store for our generation. So the reason why I'd like to hear your thoughts is because some of these changes could come from nowhere, and all of a sudden we could be in a brand new world we wouldn't have seen coming. So this video is mainly going to be about the ongoing trends, where she thinks things will be going out in the future if the trends remain as they are today. So one big one that we're going to talk about is kind of obvious when you think about it, and that is our bosses will be millennials. Millennials will make up a lot of the supervisors, managers that we will have to deal with. Furthermore, we, of course, Generation Z, will be a big part of the workforce, and that has huge effects to the job structure that we have, to the culture that we have as well. One of the comments actually on my last video was about how they get frustrated when older generations silence their grandparents. They look at them and think, oh, Generation Z is the same as millennials, or aren't you just a millennial? And of course, that's just a well-meaning mistake. But why is it frustrating? That's the interesting point. Well, the reason it's so frustrating is because there are big differences between millennials and Gen Z that will show up in the workplace going forward. Millennials, as she talks about, tend to be more community-based. They tend to like groups and like that collaboration, whereas Gen Z tends to be more on the introverted side. They tend to want more ability to do remote work, to have their own office, for instance, to have more flexibility, more ability to choose what their goals will be and how they'll get them done. Whereas millennials prefer a more collaborative culture. And this will definitely hit pretty hard because I think introversion sometimes can be taken as being antisocial. It can be taken as, well, you don't care for the group. You don't care to be like everyone else. You don't care to hang out with everyone else. You're not friendly. And as an introvert myself, I know that's not true. And many people watching this will know that's not necessarily the case, right? Sometimes we feel that way, but that's simply because we need some time to recharge because it drains us. But there are some real different cultures between millennials and Gen Z and huge differences. And that will show up really well in the coming years because by about 2030, almost all of baby boomers will be 66 plus, which is the retirement age. And so most of them, if not all, will be either part-time or retired. So the vast majority will be Gen Xers or millennials. And we'll have to deal with them and figure out how to negotiate a better way forward for work life. One big change along with this is the rise and increase of remote work, of being able to get a job where you work from your living room or your bedroom. And this was totally exacerbated by COVID-19. It shot up. And now in comparison to days where you had to come into the office no matter if it was a snowstorm or if it's raining or whatever, instead, you can then work from home and have that flexibility. But now there are some downsides to that, of course, that we have to keep in mind, and that is growing isolation. Along with this remote work will come more isolation, more loneliness, because you're not with all your friends at work, which in the past was a big way that you met romantic partners, that you met best friends, that you met long term connections you'd have for the future. And maybe Gen Z, maybe as well, tend to think about this like, oh well, we don't need those kind of friendships because after all, they're a little bit transactional. I'm only good for you because I'm working with you, right? But I could leave tomorrow and you'd just go on. You wouldn't really care. And there is a certain element to that to the corporate world. We all know that. But we can't totally discount that because something is better than nothing. And there are real people just like us who work these jobs and are kind and loving, and we would not have met them, we would not have these deep connections if we didn't work in person. You can't get that from a Slack chat. You can't get that from just texting with someone or even Zoom. It's not the same. And when you don't have that ability, the rise of loneliness could also increase. Our work life should change in some other big ways too. Things like AI will really automate a lot of past jobs, leading to a need for more flexibility and ability to do more things on the side, to understand that, well, maybe we fit this niche now, but if it gets replaced by AI or it's offshored or there's something else that happens or changes, we need to have an ability to be flexible. And that's where she talks also about the rise of the gig economy. And what is that? Well, for those of us who don't know, but I think most of us probably have something we do on the side, and that's something like Uber, or in my case, something like YouTube, or some people, they have an Etsy account. These small little things to supplement our income and allow us to grow our skills will be something that's done a lot more in the future. And it's a big trend with our generation. We should see more of. That's because with the internet today and with all of the new emerging technology, there is more opportunity than there was ever before. And that's a great thing in many ways. That's something that I'm personally am excited about. I think it's really cool to hear about the new advancements and the new changes that are going on, but at the same time, it also comes with this threat, with this fear, right? Because we don't know what's going to change in the future. We don't know how our jobs, how our lives, how they will unfold. In the past, when you look at the 50s, like most people glorify, one positive thing, although there were a lot of downsides, one positive thing though was that there was a certain level of job security and a certain level of dependence. Okay, and now that can sound like a bad thing. Being dependent on someone can sound bad, right? But think about the alternative. The alternative is being a little bit dependent upon everything, about a bunch of little things, having Uber that you do on the side, and then a part time job, and then your Etsy account, and then your dream, and then you're trying to balance all of these at the same time. And she says this will probably go up for our generation. We will see more of this back and forth. And that will give us a certain sense of concern. And I can already see it. I feel it in myself, and I feel it in a lot of my friends, that there's a certain level of concern we have, that what we have might not be that way forever. And if we have it now, or we don't have it now, we might have it in the future. It's like this feeling of not being sure. And in the past, if you have a job that you can rely on, that's going to give you a pension, that gives you health insurance, then you realize, or you have this stability in your mind that you'll be okay. That regardless of what happens, what changes happen in the future, what new headline in the news, what new president, that you'll be okay regardless because you've been at this company for 30 years and they've taken good care of you, or you know you're going to get a pension, or your retirement is there, and on and on. But we don't have those same things. So there's a certain level of concern, this ambient feeling of fear that I think a lot of us face because we're trying to stitch together our unique skill set, our unique jobs, and our unique approach versus just having one steady standby. Another thing she talks about is that our need for authenticity is higher. And so we bring our values to where we go. If we're working in a corporate job, we're trying to want our values to be reflected not just in the job and in the role we're doing and in ourselves, but the whole environment around us. And we have higher expectation for the managers and for the corporations that we have. it's a fascinating dichotomy, I think, because I think simultaneously we have more cynicism, we have more negative belief in the places that we are, in the corporations that we deal with, while simultaneously we expect more. We want more from them. We realize that they have the power and they should be doing a better job at wielding that power for people who need it and for causes that need it, rather than simply staying out of it and caring selfishly about their own concerns. Along with this, that's very interesting, is a decrease or a change in the expectations of the workplace. So, along with the tech sector, with this idea of a jean wearing, black shirt, t-shirt wearing tech bro, comes also this new change in the hierarchies. What do I mean by that? Well, when you look in the past and you look at the boomer generation, you look at the silence, there was a very hierarchical approach. Someone was at the top and someone was at the bottom. If you were an entry level, you addressed your manager by Mr. Blank, Mr. This, Mr. That, instead of it being a first name basis. And that's one example. But another one is, and I love to do this as a fun little test. Go back and look at a baseball game from the 1950s or the 1940s, even sometimes the 1960s. Everyone is dressing up to just about everything. A suit and tie is worn sometimes, like when you have your friends over. It's really fascinating when you look at it, and that's also changed. And she says the reason why this has changed is because there's a flattening in the hierarchy. What does that mean? Well, she says our generation, millennials and Gen Z primarily, look at each other like we're all equal. Like instead of there being someone at the top and someone at the bottom, instead we all just do different jobs and we come at things with a different skill set. And so we all are dressed in a similar way. The dress code has become more lax. And instead of it being you do this and you do that, and a command based approach, instead it's a question, hey, can you do this for me? The hierarchy is being flattened. People are more equal. We are dealing with each other more on an equal terms basis. And there, like I said, personally, that can have some upsides and downsides, right? It can feel a lot better when you're treated like an equal and not a subordinate, not like you're the low man on the totem pole. But the opposite side, though, is a little more insidious, and that is when there's more of this underneath the surface passive aggressive mentality. When you can tell your manager is telling you to do something, and yet they're using kind of weaselly language to tell you, well, I wouldn't mind if you would do this, or it's really important. And that's when we see the rise of speech like corporate talk. And you hear all these phrases like restructuring instead of firing, or you hear questions instead of commands. And there is something sort of refreshing when you look back and you see how people used to talk. They were more straightforward. It was more clear. Hey, this person is above me and this person is beneath. Instead of this kind of wishy-washy, weaselly language that you have to sometimes decipher and look between the lines. All right, to shift a little bit from work, let's talk about families. Well, one of the big trends that she says going forward will be a decrease in families and birth rates, because not only were millennials the lowest when it comes to birth rates, but now we're in Gen Z. And if anyone has met enough Gen Zers, then you know that there's a low likelihood there's going to be a lot of kids going forward. And why is that the case? Well, part of it, of course, is like we talked about in the past: loneliness and isolation, less sexual activity, less meeting people, less dates, all of that. And that's a big part. And, that social media and online communication is a big aspect. But another big one that she cites is more anxiety about the future, more fear of what's coming. Like we talked about earlier in the video, this struggle with stability, this struggle with feeling like you're not going to be ready for the future, you're not going to be built up, and you don't want to have a firm enough foundation to have the life that you want to going forward. And I think Gen Z struggles with that the most. And that will be a big barrier to birth rates going forward. Now, the last point I want to talk about is religion and politics. What do I mean by that? Well, we are the most atheist generation by far. We tend to have far less belief in any of the traditional religions. Now, along with that, actually has not come, according to her, has not come along with a rise in spirituality. So a lot of people in the past have seen generations and have seen the rise in atheism and have said, okay, well, they just don't like the word religious. Instead, they're using terms like spiritual. And these spiritual values sometimes are equivalent to past religions. So they have a spiritual belief in Jesus, they have a spiritual relationship. Or they tend to go towards more spiritual practices like Wiccan and things like that. However, that is not what you see with Generation Z. Instead, you see far less religion and spirituality in general. But furthermore, she says this has left a meaning gap in the lives of Gen Z, that there's a search for meaning. And in that place, a lot of times has come politics, and political values have replaced a lot of what religion would have filled the gap in the past. So the question that I have is, with this rise of polarization and voter turnout, she tends to think that Gen Z is going to be much more overrepresented, a lot like the baby boomers. But I wonder if that's the case, because if we're struggling with an external locus of control and feeling like we're having a hard time affecting things, that things are too big for us and we're struggling with anxiety and loneliness and blah, 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 that is not exactly the stew that's going to lead to you changing things. That's not going to be the pot that is going to lead to a magic spell that will make you go into politics. Instead, to me, it's going to be the opposite. It's going to be more check out, care less. But she says in her prediction, her trend is that she thinks there's going to be more voter turnout, like there has been in the past, but that's going to lead to more representation of Gen Z rather than what happened with Gen X, because the baby boomers were vastly overrepresented as a generation. But Silence and Gen X did not have nearly the presence that they did, while millennials are now coming more and more into politics and are starting to look more like the baby boomers in how they're represented, at least in America, in the representation we have in Congress. And so she tends to think, like I said, that Gen Z is going to follow more of the millennial and baby boomer rather than the Gen X and Silence when it comes to representation. So I have that question for you guys. Do you think that's going to be the case? Are we going to be overrepresented, or are we going to check out, and our anxiety and our cynicism about the systems that we're in allow us to care less and show up less? Overall, there will be a lot of trends which will be magnified in the future. Our workplace will change a great deal based upon millennials and the changing hierarchy structure that we'll have to deal with, which comes with both its pluses and its minuses. While at the same time, flexibility will become more important as AI and other advancements change things, and as there's more remote work, we'll have to adapt, so there will be more side gigs and side hustles that we'll have to engage in. And then past that, with lower birth rates, we might see some struggles with the economy and maintaining Social Security and other benefits from the government and our larger system going forward. Furthermore, we'll also see that politics and religion will have a fascinating back and forth as religion decreases with our generation and as politics increases and our care for ideology and wanting to change things on a more systemic level versus a more spiritual level. So that was a look into Jean Twenge and her work. And with that, I think that will probably be most of what we cover from her, and we'll try to cover some other things going forward. But I hope that you've learned a lot about her perspective and the information, all of the evidence that she has to work with. It should give you some insight into not just yourself and our generation around you, but also your parents, your grandparents, your older brothers and sisters, your uncles and aunts, because these trends are not just individual, not just within us, but within everyone around us. So thanks for looking into it.